Hey, it's Matthew Cudmore, and welcome to Story Behind the Stone. Today, we're joined by Ultan Moran of Dublin Cemeteries Trust, home of Glasnevin Cemetery, Ireland's national cemetery in Dublin. In today's episode, we explore the deep connections between Ireland and North America through stories of Civil War soldiers, abolitionists, and veterans of the World Wars. These lives, remembered in stone at Glasnevin, continue to shape history today. Ultan, thanks for the work you're doing to preserve these powerful stories. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We heard all about Glasnevin in the last episode. We got a 30,000 foot view. Today, we're really excited to dig into a couple more stories with you. Selfishly, we're going to talk a little bit about links to North America and Glasnevin.
Well, Glasnevin is, of course, famous in this country for having the burials of so many people who shaped Irish history. But I think it's also important to remember that with 1.5 million people, we have, the amount of burials here of people who shaped the course of world history as well, or at least were witnesses to very important events in history, not only here in Ireland or here in Europe, but across the Atlantic as well.
If we were walking with you in the cemetery, where would we find one of these individuals?
Conveniently, right at the front entrance of the cemetery. And it's a story that is quite linked to the research I would have done quite a bit in college. I mentioned in the previous podcast that I studied American history primarily and focused on the Roosevelt family. And it was about 6 years into my job here in Glasnevin Cemetery when I discovered that there was a man buried right at the front of the cemetery alongside our very impressive round tower named Dr. Thomas Addis Emmett, who had a very interesting life. He was from Virginia, but made a career for himself in New York City. He set up a women's hospital in New York where he delivered, it's estimated, around 1,100 babies. And one of those babies was the future US President, Theodore Roosevelt. And again, given that I studied the Roosevelts, you would think that I would catch on this very important connection a bit more quickly than I did 6 years on. So he was one of the most renowned doctors of the 19th century in New York. He had Irish connections. He was the grandnephew of a guy by the name of Robert Emmet, who was one of Ireland's most well-known rebel leaders. His family ultimately settled in the United States, like so many other Irish families did, and became quite influential. As I say, Dr. Thomas Addis Emmett became a doctor, very well-respected doctor. His headstone does have a bit of a exaggeration on it. Goes into a lot of detail, which is always nice in a headstone. It says that he was the founder of plastic surgery, which might be a slight exaggeration, but it's based on his service during the Civil War in the United States when he was with the Union Army and as a medic, and did quite a lot to push, soldiers back together who had been injured grievously in the conflict, serving on the front lines. And he, would have pioneered quite a lot of medical techniques, some of them probably a bit grisly, but there you are, to aid those soldiers who were injured. And so on his headstone, to mark that, he's called the founder of plastic surgery, which, as I say, maybe is slightly dramatic, but still, very interesting guy. As I say, he loved his Irish heritage. He never really visited Ireland at all, but he would have been involved in Irish-American circles in New York City. And when he died in 1919, his body was brought over the Atlantic, laid to rest here, right at the front entrance of the cemetery. And as you can probably imagine, he was quite wealthy, and his headstone, which is on top of his crypt, it's the tallest Celtic cross in the cemetery, 7 meters tall, so quite an impressive monument for Dr.
Wow.
Thomas Addis Emmett. So yeah, so he's one particular connection, and as I say, right at the front entrance here.
If I'm coming in, I'm visiting Glasnevin, and I'm walking through. I've stopped at this grave. What's the next grave that I'm going to be stopping at?
Whenever we have visitors from the United States in particular, we would always go into quite a lot of detail about the connection between the cemetery's founder, Daniel O'Connell, and the great abolitionist in the United States, Frederick Douglass. O'Connell, he was a human rights activist, a humanitarian. He fundamentally believed in equality for all people, equality in life and then equality in death as well, of course. But he didn't stop with advocating for the rights of Irish people. He advocated for the Aborigines in Australia, for example. He advocated for the independence of Poland. So he was a man very well known across the world. probably the most famous Irishman of the first half of the 19th century. And he was already quite a well-known figure in the United States because he took a very strong stand against slavery. Now, he often wanted to go to the United States, but he never did. He said that he would never sully his boot by setting foot on the land where slavery remained an institution. And so he became a hugely admired figure in the abolitionist movement. When Frederick Douglass was 27, he came to Ireland. He attended one of Daniel O'Connell's speeches here in Dublin. And in that speech, O'Connell was talking about the abolition of slavery. O'Connell was already near the end of his life at that point. Douglass was 27. And the year that he visited was 1845, which was the first year of the Great Irish Famine, which in Ireland is called An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. Douglass stayed in the country for 4 months, it's reckoned, and he wrote about the appalling situation in Ireland at the time. But he also mentioned how, he was a free man at that point, but by the law of his own country, he was treated as a runaway slave. And he remarked on the fact that people treated him as an equal. But he actually borrowed one of Daniel O'Connell's phrases that O'Connell often would have used, which was agitate, 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 in his own campaigns. And so O'Connell's campaign of, always using peaceful protest, the power of persuasion, the power of your voice, that would have inspired, the young Frederick Douglass in his own campaigns. And so that's the story I particularly like telling, that, the fact that O'Connell, being the founder of the cemetery and, very important figure in Irish history, also inspired similar men overseas.
When we see someone that inspires us, it inspires us because it resonates. We have that within us. And you can see these two men, vastly different ages, but he's almost passing that torch on. You have a swath of kids on the cemetery right now, which is so cool that your cemetery is, this destination for kids to come, and it's part of the curriculum. They come in and they're learning. I'm sure a big part of that is kind of the Irish history and stuff. Is there any others like graves that kind of relate to the topic we're on today that you would point these kids to?
One of the most important figures in Irish history was a man by the name of Eamon de Valera, who was the, in many ways, dominant political figure of 20th century Irish politics, though he was actually born in Manhattan, in New York. He from an Irish, his mother was Irish, and he was brought up here, but he, the connections between Ireland and the United States in particular were always very strong. He, for example, during our War of Independence, traveled to the United States to raise support among those in, cities with a very high Irish American population, such as New York and Boston in particular. And at this point, he was essentially, in the eyes of the, law, the government at the time, a criminal in the United Kingdom. And he was treated like a president, when he was over there, because that is what he was, according to our, election of 1918. These independent candidates advocating for Irish independence won a mandate, and essentially they were campaigning for complete independence from Britain. So he raised several $1 million in the United States. A funny story is he attended a meeting with a Native American group who were, hailing Eamon de Valera's career and all of that. And Eamon de Valera, being a great advocate of the Irish language, got up and delivered a speech entirely in the Irish language. And essentially nobody there could understand what he was saying because he decided not to do it in English as a point, I suppose. So we would always bring that in, these different, connections between that very important era in Irish history and then, the people over in the United States who tried as much as they could to, raise support.
Alden, in more recent history, you were in New York City. Did you visit any folks that are buried there that have an Irish ancestry or link to Ireland at all?
There's many different Irish connections in Greenwood Cemetery out in Brooklyn. The wife of the rebel leader, Wolfe Tone, is buried there. Huge Irish American population in New York, so plenty of them buried in that one cemetery. A lot of Celtic crosses over there too, very Irish symbol. So it was almost like being back at work, really, in many ways, except I could see the Manhattan skyline in the distance, which was a bit of a change. But there you are.
We're gonna have to get you out to Beechwood in Canada, because that's one of the things you'll notice quite often is the amount of Celtic crosses that sit in our national cemetery as well. So if you're ever in the area, we'll make sure to hook you up with our contacts.
That is on my bucket list, my cemetery bucket list, which it's kind of an odd thing to have a cemetery bucket list, but I think in this area, a lot of people would. So there you are.
Yeah, I have a cemetery bucket list as well, and
yeah, good. I'm not alone then. Good.
Right on there, near the top of that list for sure.
Good.
But
good.
This is the interesting thing is what you see, and this is why I'm loving talking to you, because I learn more and more all the time. Is just how these very influential Irish figures play a role throughout the world. Whether it's at home in Ireland, or you can see in North America and Canada. One of the things that we tend to look at is how some of the veterans and people who served in some of the wars have had an influence. Is there any individuals that perhaps are buried that were involved in any conflicts?
Yes, we have a very rich military history here in Glasnevin, and one particular example I'd give is a man who served during the American Civil War by the name of William Dillon Walker, who was from Dublin, from a place called Golden Bridge, not far from the original cemetery that O'Connell set up, actually. But as a young man, he served with papal forces, but then went over to the United States, where he enlisted in the Union Army. He fought during the Battle of the Wilderness, which was one of the great battles of the Civil War under the command of Ulysses S. Grant. It's reckoned that there's around 200,000 Irish-born men who served during the American Civil War, primarily on the Union side, the vast majority of whom, and then it's reckoned around 20,000 on the Confederate side during the conflict too. But William Dillon Walker, he died, as I said, in the Battle of the Wilderness. His headstone was erected here in Dublin, and for a while I thought that his body was, sent across the Atlantic. But it was actually quite a nice story. He was buried in the United States, but his friends back in Dublin, when they heard of his death, they erected a very nice Celtic cross for him, right at the original entrance of the cemetery as well. And the headstone says that he died for the restoration of the Great Republic of the United States. That's inscribed on his headstone, which is quite a nice, tribute to them, particularly because he's not buried there. It's his friends put a lot of effort into making sure that his memory would be there forever.
When we have veteran cemeteries now, you have these headstones that are supported by the military or individuals. But back then, there wasn't something that the military would generally do, and it would have to be your friends. And in this cemetery, there's individuals who died during service on their ships or wherever, and you can see these headstones, and they're saying, but like they would literally go around and collect money to pay for one of these headstones, and it would be raised by their shipmates. And these individuals were quite loved by their comrades, and that sounds like one of those stories where it's like, yeah, they put this beautiful headstone there, even though he gave his life in a battle in the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the work that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission does is very important, of course, in marking graves that were previously unmarked. In Glasnevin Cemetery in particular, I would work with them quite a bit. As I think I mentioned in the previous episode, that the majority of the people in the cemetery are unmarked, and that would include a lot who would have served during the World Wars, who for decades, for whatever reason, family funds or, went unmarked. And, over the past 20 years, I'd say quite a lot of them have lovely new headstones, that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission would have helped us out with. In fact, it was about 230 in the entire cemetery at this point, most of whom fought during the First World War, and then I think about 40 of whom served during the Second World War. So it's an ongoing project, but as I say, it's certainly a very worthwhile one.
So you have these Commonwealth headstones. Do you happen to know offhand any of the stories of those individuals?
So actually, two connections to Canada. There was a guy called Peter Conroy who enlisted with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces during the First World War. He was fighting near the Belgian border, and he was shot by a sniper. He ultimately, and in the head as well, but he survived the injury, but was returned home to Dublin, but in a completely awful way, you know, as you can imagine. Now he died in 1918 in Dublin, but as a result of his injuries. And then there was another guy named James Carroll as well, who also served with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. Both of whom would have emigrated from Dublin, served with, you know, or went over to Canada, enlisted, and then returned across the waves. And he ultimately fought, as I say, in the trenches of the First World War and survived, but returned to Dublin. And of course, what came after the First World War, the influenza pandemic and of the Spanish flu. And he actually died as a result of the Spanish flu. Both of whose headstones, I believe, Mr. Carroll, the Canadian government actually purchased his grave in the cemetery for him. You know, things like that are quite nice to hear, you know, that these men who were originally unmarked, who ultimately, you know, played a very key role, I suppose, were no longer forgotten, which is, you know, quite a nice thing.
One of the things that not many people recognize about the Spanish flu during that time is that the estimates are somewhere like 50 to 100 million people died. You know, and that's more people died due to the Spanish flu than the actual conflict at the time, which was the First World War, which is just it's mind-boggling. And you know, I'm sure there's a lot of victims of the Spanish flu buried in your cemetery, given when it was.
We had an exhibition in the museum that we have here in the cemetery back in 2019, which the centenary, I suppose, you know, but it's kind of focusing on the effects of it in Glasnevin, and not only from the perspective of public health, but in terms of the logistics of so many people dying in Dublin and the logistics of burying so many people in such a short span of time. Cemetery was really put under a huge amount of pressure that hadn't been seen since cholera outbreaks in the 1840s and 50s. So it really did, you know, decimate entire communities. You know, in pandemics and, you know, events like that, a cemetery is often the place where you find, in a burial record, for example, because it often was the poorest of the poor who died, somebody's name in a register book, cause of death, influenza, might be the one reminder of that person, the one bit of legacy of that person today, which is quite sad in one way, but at the same time, it shows you how great of a historical resource, I suppose, the archives of the cemetery are.
There's these major events that go throughout history. You have, you know, the Spanish flu, but people often forget just how catastrophic the Irish famine was. And I assure you have a ton of victims of the Irish famine there. Just for our listeners who might not know what that was, would you mind giving some kind of context to that?
It's often called here in Ireland An Gorta Mór, which is Irish for the Great Hunger. At the time, a considerable portion of the population of the country, which was 8 million at the time, relied on the potato crop. Potatoes are, of course, easy to make. They're, you know, give people all they need really in life, heavily reliant on it. And then blight arrived across Europe, but here in Ireland, blight decimated the potato crop. And so millions of people no longer had that food source that they relied upon. And so within the span of just a few years, the social fabric of the country, the political fabric of the country completely became undone. Now, Daniel O'Connell, the founder of the cemetery, as I said, in the 1840s, he was near the end of his life. And in March of 1847, which in Ireland, 1847, it was the worst year of the famine. It's called Black 47, you know, so it was a truly traumatic year for this country. And in March 1847, O'Connell was in Parliament at Westminster, and he delivered a speech in which he warned that if something is not done, that 25% of the population will be lost. And those words ultimately proved very true. In the famine, 1 million people died, starvation and related diseases, and 1 million, of course, emigrated across the sea to the United States, to Canada, to England. The population since then hasn't recovered to the famine time. So I think the entire island of Ireland has a population of around 6 million now, if I'm not mistaken, 6-7 million, and the population before the famine was 8 million. So completely decimated entire areas of the country. Dublin, quite a large city, of course, it wasn't as impacted as places on the west coast of Ireland. Counties like Galway, Mayo, Kerry, Donegal, they would have been affected incredibly. Here in Dublin, though, many people did die as a result of the famine, but it's difficult to provide an exact number of those who died, because on a burial record, it's not going to say cause of death, famine. It's going to say malnutrition. It's going to say one of the diseases like typhus or cholera that would have spread at around the same time. That's why, as I mentioned, Frederick Douglass, he visited Ireland just as the famine was starting to begin, and he was shocked and appalled by the conditions that he witnessed here. So An Gorta Mór, it really remained in the folk memory of the people of Ireland. Even now, it's in some parts of the country, it's still a topic that people aren't comfortable discussing. It's a very emotive topic in Ireland. And it's why there are more people, Irish people, people of Irish descent living in the United States, and, about the same amount of people from an Irish background living in Canada. I think just over 4 million Canadians describe their ethnic background as Irish in 2021. That is why there's such a huge Irish diaspora, because for decades after the famine, people were, leaving the country.
There's significant Irish populations, and that emigration during that time and the ties in, and ultimately when it came to war with Canada and the world in the First and Second World War, Canada had, I believe, 3 different Irish regiments that were put together. And so in First World War, we would see a lot of like the Irish, the Scots regiments and such. And these were basically regiments that were put together with similar heritage. This is why I find cemeteries so interesting. And again, why Glasnevin ends up being on top of my list is because it's a place in Ireland, but it's connected directly to the United States, to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
It's our history. Is there any other story that you would like to talk a little bit more about before we wrap up?
Well, quite a sad connection to Canada is, of course, I think a lot of people, Canadian listeners in particular, will be familiar with the 1985 Air India disaster, the worst terrorist attack in Canadian history, I believe. Now, that was off the southern coast of Ireland, off the coast of County Cork, I believe. I think it was Montreal, and it was flying to India, and a bomb exploded in the plane off the coast, and many of the funerals, because of course it would have to take place here in Ireland given the proximity, happened right here in Glasnevin Cemetery. Glasnevin at the time had the only crematorium in the Republic of Ireland, and so the victims, many of them, were actually sent to Glasnevin Cemetery. Now, quite a sad connection is that they were cremated here in Glasnevin. We actually only have one burial from the Air India bombing. It was a young baby named Ankur Seth, and he went kind of unidentified for quite a long time. He lost family members in the attack, but he was buried here in Glasnevin Cemetery, and his name was eventually put up on a little headstone for him, quite close to where I'm standing now. In fact, about a year ago now, I had members from the Canadian Mounted Police, the counter-terrorism unit, and they got in contact with me, and they came over to Glasnevin Cemetery, and they wanted to pay their respects at Ankur Seth's grave. They placed it's a nice little tradition to place a little stone or a little pebble or a coin and a candle on his little grave. When we talk to people about the Canadian connections to Glasnevin Cemetery, his story is probably the first one that I would always, tell people. An incredibly tragic story, of course. But you were mentioning the links and all of that. Of course, those links are often family links, and which are always nice to talk about. But we also have links to some of the most tragic events, over the last 2 centuries here as well. And 1985 Air India disaster is certainly among them.
It's a sad story, and it's something you say Air India. Almost every Canadian knows that story. Again, another reason to come visit the site. What's next for you? What's on the docket?
To set up a different video content, kind of telling people about these stories at the cemetery, on TikTok and on Instagram. Because I've kind of an American history background, I often try to sneak little connections to the United States into it under the radar.
Well, Alton, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed hearing just the history, and again, it's just that interconnectedness that history has, and how some of these individuals' impacts just ripple throughout the world. And I feel a little closer to Ireland, and I hope our listeners do too after listening to the show.
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Story Behind the Stone is available on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on the Reach Across America radio network, on iHeartRadio, Audacity, and TuneIn. Just search for Wreath. Thank you for tuning in.